Okay. Thanks for joining us, everybody, did I just get logged out? No, I'm still here. Sorry. Thanks for joining us, everybody, for our Chum Salmon in the Clackamas River webinar. My name is Amy Barton, and I'm the Communications and Program Stewardship Manager for the Clackamas River Basin Council. And I'm joined by our presenter and special guest, Kelcee Smith, from the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. And Kelcee Smith is the project leader for the program to restore Oregon's chum salmon for ODFW. And let's go ahead and get started. So first, I'm going to start with a land designation. Many of us are joining from Oregon and Washington, and I'd like to take a moment to recognize that we are gathered on the unceded land of many Native peoples. I ask you to join us in acknowledging the many communities, their elders, both past and present, as well as future generations. This acknowledgement demonstrates a commitment to beginning the process of working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. We thank those who came before us for their stewardship of these lands and waters, and those who continue to steward them now and into the future. And before I pass the mic over to Kelcee, I'd like to share just a quick intro into who we are at CRBC. We are guided by our mission, which is to foster partnerships for clean water, to improve fish and wildlife habitat, and enhance the quality of life for those who live, work, and recreate within the Clackamas River Basin. We are a 501c3 nonprofit watershed council, and for over 20 years now, we've been invested in restoring and protecting the Clackamas River and all of its tributaries for fish like chum, wildlife, and drinking water quality. And we do this through lots of ways: in-stream and riparian restoration projects. And the photo on the left shows some of our contractors installing large wood in a stream for fish habitat. We also host volunteer events and educational workshops, just like this one, free for all. And the image in the middle shows our Down the River cleanup, where volunteers help us clean a 22-mile stretch of the Clackamas River. We also offer streamside residents with free weed removal and native tree and shrub planting through our Shade Our Streams program. And we help residents with wildfire recovery. So far through these programs, we've installed over 723,000 trees and shrubs in the basin in the last 10 years. And all of our work is aimed at improving the Clackamas River, but of course, we can't do any of this without all of you, our supporters and friends. And I'm going to go ahead and pass it to Kelcee now, but before I do, you could please keep yourself on mute while she's presenting. That would be great. And feel free to pop your questions into the chat as they come up, and I'll read them at the end. And we'll also have a Q&A when Kelcee is all wrapped up for your live questions. Alrighty.
Thanks, Amy, for that great introduction. And let me get my screen up now. And here we go. Can everybody see that? Okay. So as Amy said, my name is Kelcee Smith, and I work for the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife for the program to restore Oregon's chum salmon. And so today I'm going to give you a very brief history of chum salmon here in the Clackamas River. And I always like to start these presentations by introducing people to chum, because not everybody knows who they are. They're also called dog salmon or calico salmon, or sometimes they're called keta. So those are several names that are out there that you might also hear about. But they, in general, they're kind of this olive green color when they come back to spawn, and they have these reddish purple stripes. They also have really prominent teeth. They're kind of dog-like, which is how they get that common name as well. They're also pretty big. They're our second biggest salmon here in the Pacific Northwest. The only ones that are bigger are Chinook salmon. Chum salmon also have the widest range of all of the salmon here in the Pacific Northwest. So this is a map of all of the different spawning areas that you can find them in. And so you can see that they range from Japan and Korea and Russia all the way over to Alaska and into Canada. The green areas are where they spawn currently. The yellow areas are where they have limited spawning, and the red areas are where they used to spawn. And so today I'm going to talk about the chum salmon that we have here in the lower Columbia River. So chum salmon here exhibit a fall life cycle. And so that means that the adults return to the tributaries of the lower Columbia River in the fall to spawn. And so that's what this green area is on the map here. And the star is where the Clackamas River is. In the wintertime, they lay their eggs, and those eggs incubate in the gravel over the winter. They stay nice and protected there. And then by the springtime, in March, April time, the fries start to outmigrate towards the lower Columbia River estuary and eventually end up in the ocean. Now, unlike other salmon that we have in the Pacific Northwest, chum salmon fry leave these systems really quickly. They only stay in these freshwater systems for a handful of months. So unlike steelhead or coho or chinook that sometimes stay months and months or years in freshwater systems, chum fry leave really quickly. And that's kind of a unique trait that they have among all the salmon here. And then of course, chum, like all salmon, spend anywhere from 3 to 5 years in the ocean, growing and developing into adults, but they don't stay right offshore like this. The adults actually migrate from our area all the way back up to the Bering Sea, where they mix around with all the other chum from all the other countries before they return back to the Columbia River to spawn. And so when they do come back to spawn, they select specific habitat to do their spawning. And when you think about that kind of habitat that they use in freshwater, I want you to think about places that are low and cold. So chum like to occupy lower portions of the watershed. They like streams that have low gradients. They like low levels of fine sediment in the system. They like low barriers, and they really prefer these natural cold water seeps or springs. And so if we look at this diagram of a watershed here, chum prefer those areas that have low gradients. So the stream on the right might be a little bit steeper and have a higher gradient, whereas the stream on the left has that smaller angle, which means it's more accessible to chum. So in this diagram, you might imagine that chum would occupy or come back and spawn in the areas in yellow, right? And anywhere where you can find this gravel or kind of low levels of sediment are places that they would be too. A lot of times when people think about salmon, this is the image that comes to their mind. They think of these big migrations and salmon dodging bears and jumping over waterfalls. But the salmon in this picture is not a chum. This is another image that may come to your mind about these large salmon migrations, big, big jumpers. These are also not chum. So when I say that chum have very limited jumping ability, they really can't access things that have a lot of barriers. So anything that's in the way on their migration back to their spawning ground has to be pretty low. Anything less than 3 feet is probably best for them. They're not really known for their jumping abilities. And so this is what I'm talking about for chum. And so when we think about all of these habitat characteristics together, the Clackamas River is really a great place for chum. And you can see a lot of those features here in this picture. You can see the nice gravel bar down at the bottom right. You can see that there's not a lot of gradient here. The water is really clean and clear. And we know that there's lots of cold water springs and seeps within the Clackamas River. And in fact, we see a lot of historical evidence that chum were present in the Clackamas. This is an article from the Oregon City Enterprise that dates back to 1895 that talks about the tribal members catching dog salmon in the upper Clackamas River. We also have another article from the Oregon City Enterprise talking about how productive the Clackamas River is in terms of salmon, and how the more salmon came out of the Clackamas than the entire wheat crop of the state, which is a really cool thing to think about. But this was also 130 years ago. And so what's happened since then? And so at this point in the presentation, I usually like to ask if anyone has ever seen a chum in the Clackamas, because usually I don't get many hands that are raised. And you wouldn't be alone. They are really rare in the Clackamas River today. I'm going to talk about this catch of a chum salmon, which just happened last fall, in a little bit, but it was the first record of a chum salmon in the Clackamas in about 40 years. So you're not alone if you haven't seen one out on the Clackamas or in any of the tributaries. And so next I want to talk about what happened and why there aren't any more chum in the Clackamas. And it's basically due to two reasons. First, there was a lot of harvest in the lower Columbia River for chum back in the day. And then over the last 100 years or so, we've seen a lot of spawning habitat loss for chum. And so if we dive right into the harvest of chum salmon on the lower Columbia River, you can see that presented here in this graph by Johnson et al. From 1997. This is all the commercial landings data from the Columbia River, which includes Oregon and Washington from about the late 1800s. And so while this is scientific data, we also have more anecdotal data to confirm this as well. Here's another article from the Oregonian from February of 1910 that is talking about the number of landings of chum salmon in that year. And it might be hard to read, but I've highlighted it here. In that year, between the states, over 1.6 million pounds of chum salmon was harvested. And so that corresponds to about this point on the graph. But what's interesting is that that wasn't even the peak, right? Much later, in about 1926, over 1 million chum salmon returned to the Columbia River, which of course is about 100 years ago. You might also notice from this graph the steep decline in about the 1950s. And we have more data for that too. We see this decline in the 1940s and the 1950s because of this overharvest. And again, it's recorded not only with our scientific data, but also for the general public in the newspapers in 1940 and 1953. Chum salmon are steadily dwindling, and the late fall run is scanty, which really just shows how we depended a lot on this fish during the early 20th century, and also how these populations started to wane over time. Also during this time, we're seeing the land change a lot in the lower Columbia River. So this is a map of the Oregon side of the lower Columbia, and it's basically what the land looked like before there was any settlement on the landscape. And you can see that basically it was all forested area with some grass and shrubland in light green. But this is what that same area looks like today. And so you can see a lot of the forested area has changed into agricultural lands, which is orange, or urban areas, which is that dark color where the city of Portland is now, or forests have been cut down and replanted, and that's the yellow areas. And so when we have so many land use changes throughout this time period, it means that there's a lot more pollution and lower water quality in our streams and rivers. This also results in more fine sediment being put into these systems. Without the trees around these streams, it means that the water temperature increases, And when you combine all of these things together, it means that there's more disease and parasites that our fish are exposed to. If I outline the Clackamas River Basin here in pink, you can see that there's really been a lot of land changes over time in the Clackamas River watershed in particular. There's also dams that we have to consider, especially here in the Clackamas River. We have two dams, as you all probably know. We've got the North Fork Dam, which was constructed in 1958. And this dam was probably at the higher end of the range for chum salmon. They probably didn't get much higher in the watershed than the North Fork Dam. So it may not have been much of a problem for them historically or even now. But we also have the Willamette Falls Dam that is definitely within the area that chum would historically spawn in this watershed. And we have some records of chum crossing the dam here recently, but none before 2020. And as you can see in the last 4 years, it's really only been a handful every year. And regardless of whether or not chum can pass over these dams due to really great fish ladders, dams change a lot about the water when they're put in place. They change the temperature of the water, they change the flow, they can change the turbidity and how much sediment is flushed out of these streams or not. They also affect the edge habitats of our streams. And it sounds really simple, right? But they also affect how much water is available downstream of them. And it is really simple, but fish need water in order to exist. And so if those dams are preventing that water from moving downstream, then fish literally have less habitat available to them. So with all of these factors combined, chum salmon were listed as threatened on the Endangered Species Act in 1999. Here in Oregon, we have 8 recovery populations. And because the Columbia River is situated between the state of Oregon and Washington, and it's a federally listed species, there's lots of collaborative recovery effort that goes on between a lot of different agencies. And so if we look at those 8 recovery populations a little bit closer, here at ODFW, we kind of break them down into 3 different categories. Closer to the mouth of the Columbia River, we have a lot of concentrated effort where we do a lot of reintroduction out there, as well as some habitat restoration. I don't have time to talk about that today, but you can certainly ask me questions about that later. Further up in the watershed, in the gorge, we do a lot of joint effort there with WDFW, especially because those populations cross the state boundary. And then kind of in the middle here in the Cascade region, we do a lot of baseline monitoring for any residual populations that might be occurring in these watersheds. And so that's where the Clackamas River fits in this scenario. And that's what I'm going to finish the presentation talking about. And so you might be thinking at this point, okay, Kelcee, you've told us that chum are really rare in the Clackamas and that they're really hard to find and no one's seen one for a really long time. How in the world do you monitor a species that you can't even find? And so the answer to that is, first, you get a lot of other people to help you, including the Clackamas River Basin Council and a few other watersheds in the area and funding and a bunch of other partners. And then the second way you do it is you use technology. And so I'm going to now talk about a new-ish technology that a lot of scientists have been using recently called environmental DNA. It's also known as eDNA. And basically, this is a technique that we can use to identify DNA present in water samples. And so while fish are swimming out in the environment, they're shedding their DNA all the time from their skin, from their waste products, when they spawn, as their bodies decompose. So the DNA is just in the water. If we take a water sample and that fish's DNA is there, then we can detect it. And so this is a really sensitive method too. We can detect DNA up to 1 kilometer downstream of the source over a 2-week period. And this is really cool because it means that I can tell you whether or not a fish was present in that water body without having even seen it. And so this is really important for us and my group for guiding habitat restoration projects, for determining what kind of reintroduction effort we need to do, as well as guiding other surveys. It's really easy to take an eDNA sample. It's really hard to send a crew out into the middle of nowhere to survey a really remote stream. And so just really briefly, this is kind of what it looks like. Like I said, we use pumps to filter the water. It takes about 15 minutes to collect just over a gallon of water, which is what we need to determine if the eDNA is present or not. We sample during the peak return and the peak out migration, when we would expect the most chum to be in the system as possible. Then we send the filters off to a lab to be analyzed, and we usually get results between 4 to 6 weeks. So it's pretty quick turnaround. Here in the Clackamas River, we've been doing this monitoring since 2023. And these are all of the locations that we have sampled throughout the watershed: Johnson Creek, Abernathy Creek, Clear Creek, Richardson, Eagle, as well as some spots in the main stem of the Clackamas. And basically we're looking for sites that have suitable spawning areas where we might expect chum to be. And then, like I said, we sample twice in the fall to detect the adults, and then twice in the spring to detect any fry. And really, this is a technique at this point we're using as a baseline so that we can determine what other surveys we need to do later. And so for 2023, if we kind of zoom in on the Clackamas River here, the first thing that happened last fall is I got a call from a fisherman. Actually, it was an email. And he said, "Kelcee, I caught a chum on the Clackamas River." And I said, "No, you didn't. That's so silly. There hasn't been a chum on the Clackamas in forever." Except he sent me this picture too. And this fish is obviously a chum salmon. You can see the stripes from space, right? And so he caught and released this fish on November 3rd, 2023. And like I said, it was the first catch of a chum in the Clackamas in about 40 years. So that was really cool, but it got even cooler because later on, Dave Bugney and I, also from the Clackamas River Basin Council, went up a couple weeks later and sampled for eDNA near Eagle Creek. And when I sent that sample off to the lab, it came back as positive, which was really great. And so what we can assume is that this fish that was released by this angler swam approximately 8 miles upstream, died or spawned or was present somewhere above Eagle Creek. The DNA floated downstream where Dave and I collected it. And so there is at least, we got a double detection of this fish in the Clackamas River last fall. And so because of this, I gave a quick presentation for CRBC last spring that led to a Bill Monroe article that eventually drummed up more chum awareness in the area. And so you can see the point here is that it takes the entire community to kind of keep tabs on where these fish are when they're so rare. And so this leads me to tell you more about how you can be involved with this project. And so the first thing you can do is be a good steward. And I'm going to go through a few things here. These are just my ideas. You may have other ones too, but I think these are some of the best ones too. So plant native plants in your yard or green space. Think about water use and runoff in your property, right? We don't want ditches that look like this. We want ditches that look nice and clean and help filter the water of any of those fine sediments. We also have a lot of ODFW surveys surveyors that go out to survey these streams for a lot of different salmon species. And so if you're lucky enough to have a property that backs up to a stream in the area, the best thing to do is cooperate with those surveyors so we can get really good data about the fish populations in our area. The other thing you can do is follow all fishing regulations, right? That angler caught the chum, took a quick picture, and then released it safely back into the wild. If he hadn't done that, we wouldn't have been able to get the eDNA detection to really confirm that that fish was there. If you're not a fisherman or an angler, you can still recreate responsibly if you're, hiking or canoeing or kayaking. Don't leave your trash. Another thing you can do is tell others what you've learned about chum today. I have lots of information to share in a pretty short amount of time. So the more that we can let people know about chum, the better. The other thing you can do is advocate for chum. You can do that by supporting your local watershed council like CRBC. You can volunteer, donate money, tell them that you want chum specific habitat restoration projects. That is very helpful for me and my team as well. You can also call ODFW, your local district biologist, and tell them that you support chum recovery in your area. That is helpful for my program as well. It's an election year, so I also have to mention that the people that represent you at the local, state, and federal level all have a role to play in our environmental concerns. And so if you have any, you should reach out to those folks and tell them how you feel. And then lastly, you can email or call me first if you want me to speak at another event or another group that you might be a part of. Or maybe more importantly, if you ever encounter a chum, please call me and tell me about it. It can really help the research and the work that I do and my team does. And without you guys, we can't know some of this stuff. The very last thing you can do is volunteer with my group. We do lots of different things just about every month of the year. We do a lot of spawning out near Astoria at Big Creek Hatcheries. So you can help us do that. You can help us take or collect eDNA samples, and there's lots of other stuff too. The best way to get involved is to either email me or sign up online on the ODFW volunteer page. There should be a chum link there that you can click and get all the paperwork done, and you can get ready to go to help us. It's really fun. So the last little bit here, just some take-home messages for you. The first thing is that chum salmon were common in the Clackamas River historically, but because of harvest and habitat loss, we don't really see them there anymore today. And so they're really rare in the Clackamas River. But ODFW and a bunch of our partners are monitoring chum with eDNA, and that can help us guide habitat restoration projects to document any natural recolonization that we might see and to direct future reintroduction efforts in the watershed. And so I just want to thank everyone for their time and attention. And if you have any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat or maybe raise your hand. If we run out of time today, feel free to email me. My email is up here on the screen. I'm happy to talk with you about anything chum related here in Oregon. So thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Kelcee. And we do have a couple questions that I can read for you.
Sounds good.
Our first question is ODFW planning to actively reintroduce chum into the Clackamas? Even though one was found and detected, they're obviously rare. And since one was here, it seems like the Clackamas would be a good candidate for reintroduction.
Yeah, so at this time, we don't have any plans to do any active reintroduction in the Clackamas River. We're still, quite a ways off from doing that. Like I said, I didn't have a time to talk about it in today's presentation, but we are doing a lot of active reintroduction in the Big Creek area and the Clackamas River area, out closer to the mouth of the river. And so we're working on establishing that first before we expand reintroduction into a place like the Clackamas. I do agree that it is a strong candidate though for a reintroduction area.
Awesome, thank you. And then one more question. Are there similar chum eDNA surveillance studies in other watersheds? And is there a comparison between Clackamas and other lower Columbia tributaries?
That's a great question. We are also doing eDNA sampling in Scappoose, in the Scappoose Creek area, as well as the Sandy River. And we've been monitoring for about the same amount of time there in both of those areas, and we haven't gotten any detections there yet. The Clackamas River is the only positive detection that we've gotten since we've started this monitoring. Before I came onto this project, my predecessor did more eDNA sampling further up in the gorge, both in places where they knew chum were spawning and in places where they suspected that they weren't spawning. And so she has a paper out about that I can share with you guys if you're interested. But that is really the foundational work that I've used to kind of build our current monitoring, because we know it works. I know it can detect chum even in places where they aren't, that sort of thing. So yes, because of how easy and relatively cheap eDNA monitoring is, we're trying to do it in as many places as we can.
Great, looks like you may have another volunteer who can help out.
I see.
Who will email you. So I'm going to put in Kelcee's email into the chat. I know it's on the screen, but you guys can copy and paste it this way.
Yeah, that's great.
And I actually have one quick question.
Okay.
So there was the one salmon, it was the first chum salmon that was found in 40 years, caught by that individual, and then a detection 8 miles up. Is there a way to tell if it was the same salmon? Or is it kind of, it's just, it's chum, but you don't know which chum?
Yeah. So there is a way to do it. It's just really hard. Environmental DNA in general degrades really quickly because it's not like attached to the organism anymore. So like when it's in the water, heat can degrade it, flow can, break it up into pieces and stuff. And so if you don't have an intact strand of DNA, it's really hard to say like, oh, that DNA belongs to this individual fish versus that individual fish. And so you can do it. It's really expensive. It's really hard. But for our purposes and what we need to know, we aren't doing that. We're more interested in just learning, oh my gosh, chum, we're here. And so it doesn't really make sense for us to identify it back to an individual.
That makes sense. And we do have one more question that just came through.
Mm-hmm.
Erica's wondering, what's your education background and what career pathways or opportunities specific to the Portland metro area would you recommend for someone that's wanting to do more conservation work around fish and wildlife?
This is a great question. So I am actually from the Southeast. And so a lot of my fish experience is in the Gulf of Mexico. And so I've done work on everything from seahorses to sharks. I have an undergraduate degree in marine biology. I have a PhD in renewable and natural resources from Louisiana State University. So that's kind of the schooling, but I usually tell people that want to be involved in this career to really get your undergrad degree in a science related field, right? Fisheries, biology, even forestry is fine. Some sort of biological degree for your undergrad is a great place to start. After that, I don't recommend that kids go immediately to grad school. I think it's way more advantageous to go through a bunch of different jobs and see what you like and what you don't like in the field. It gives you experience, it gives you exposure to different projects. You meet a bunch of different people. You learn what you like, you learn what you absolutely hate doing, and you get to earn money along the way. When you go to grad school, it's really hard. You don't really get paid that much. It can take a long time. And no matter how much you love your project at the beginning, at the end, you're probably going to hate it. So you want to start with something that you really, really enjoy doing. And so I think taking the time, volunteering, working at all the different types of jobs that you can have out in this field is way more beneficial than going to school immediately after. I also did that, so that's why I advocate for that path, because I think it worked out well. As far as things specific to the Portland metro area, I mean, Mount Hood Community College is a really great place to start your undergrad or your associate's degree. They have a great fisheries program there. I would say volunteering or getting involved with any of the local watershed councils is a good place to start too. That's a whole nother side of this field that needs a lot more support from young folks. You can also volunteer with ODFW. We also have a lot of seasonal positions throughout the year on various projects that you can get involved with. So those are a few things I can think of off the top of my head, but keep looking. There's lots of stuff to do out there.
I'm gonna pop in, Erica, a couple links into the chat for you for career posting. This is where I found my job here at CRBC. And there's also the network of Oregon watershed councils, and they post many, many jobs as well. So I'll put that in there for you. And I agree with what Kelcee said about taking some time between undergrad and master's. That's also what I did. They were about 10 years apart. So I had a biology degree and then did something completely different for a while, and then went back for a master's in nonprofit administration, and then kind of found my calling here at CRBC. So there's many different types of jobs in the conservation sector, like Kelcee was saying. You know, I'm not necessarily a scientist, but still get to work in this field, doing communications and grant writing, and I still feel fulfilled in the conservation world. And we do have one more question for Kelcee. Let's see, it says, okay, so chum seem to be prevalent in the Tillamook Bay rivers and seem to be caught for sport. Is that still the case? And also, do chum have any commercial value?
Yeah, so all of the chum that are along the Oregon coast, including the ones in Tillamook Bay and those rivers in that region, they are considered a separate population from the ones that we have here in the Lower Columbia River. The ones on the Oregon coast are not listed on the Endangered Species Act. Here in Oregon, you can catch and release those guys. In the state of Oregon, in the state of Oregon and the Lower Columbia River, there is no commercial fishery for chum salmon at this time. There's too few of them for there to be one. Also because the ones in the Lower Columbia are listed, and so that complicates things too. The commercial value for chum historically has kind of been twofold. The first is that they were used a lot in the canneries, and so that was one of the main species that people used to can back in the day. And you may have noticed that there's not that many canneries anymore, and that's because we don't have as many chum anymore. The other thing that made them valuable commercially was their roe or their eggs, and so those were, you know, sold as either, you know, for like caviar or sushi, that kind of thing. A lot of people like to eat the roe, and so If you see chum today out, at your supermarket or anything like that, it likely comes from Alaska or overseas. And so you will still see chum in the market. And that's, perfectly normal. Other places have sustainable populations of chum to allow for commercial harvest, but we don't here in the Lower Columbia.
I believe, oh, wait. One more question from Erica. Are there any fines on fishers if they were to catch chum and not release them back? And are most fishers familiar with how endangered and rare the chum are?
Yes, so you're not allowed to, here in Oregon for the Lower Columbia, you're not allowed to retain a chum salmon. And so if you were caught with one, you would certainly be subject to all of the regulations that apply there. I would say in general that most people don't know a lot about chum or even that they exist in our neck of the woods. Sometimes I'll get comments from folks about how they used to see chum out there or how they remember, catching one back in the day. But more often than not, those stories are from places like Alaska, where people say like, oh, like, no, I would never catch a chum here in Oregon. I would just go to Alaska for that because there's so many more up there. And they're right. So that's why I think it's pretty important, not only for me to share this information to different groups, like I'm doing today, but also for you guys as you learn things to go out and share too. Because really, the more people that are talking about chum, the more people keep them top of mind. And then the more reports I can get, and then the more awareness that there is just overall about them and the trouble that they're in.
All right, I think that wraps up our questions, and everyone has Kelcee's email in the chat. I can go ahead and put mine in there too, just in case anyone has any questions for us or questions about watershed councils in general. Thank you all so much for joining us. And thank you so much, Kelcee, for the wonderful presentation.
Thank you. Thanks everybody for your attention and for having me today.
Awesome. All right. Bye, everybody. All right, I will get the recording.